Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's inaugural lecture to be given by Professor Phillips O'Brien. These inaugurals are one of the highlights of the academic calendar when our newly minted professors get the chance to talk to an audience of staff and students from across the university, members of the public and friends and family. Phillips O'Brien, I just discovered, was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but he moved not too far away to do his first degree in history and philosophy at Trinity College, Hartford in Connecticut. He then worked in a law office in Wall Street for 2 years before moving to the University of Cambridge for his PhD in history with Zara Steiner. After completing the PhD, he was appointed Cambridge's Mellon Research Fellow in US History and a Research Fellow at Pembroke College. In 1997, he moved to the University of Glasgow, where he was first a lecturer, then reader, and then a professor in history. But happily for us, in 2016, he moved to the University of St Andrews to take up the chair in strategic studies in the School of International Relations and to be a key member of the Interdisciplinary Institute for the Study of War and Strategy. He's published 4 books and numerous shorter pieces. His articles have appeared in journals such as Past and Present, Diplomatic History, and the Journal of Strategic Studies. In 2015, he published his most recent book with Cambridge University Press, entitled How the War Was Won, Air, Sea Power and Allied Victory in World War II. This is a 250,000-word reassessment of the course of the war based on resource allocation and destruction. And the book was very well received. For example, the Times Higher Education supplement said, "This is a brave, important and impressively researched book, and all who have written on the Second World War will have to consider O'Brien's cogent arguments." Or the Journal of Modern History, who noted, "O'Brien deserves high praise for writing a book that will force scholars to think hard about the nature of World War II and perhaps also about the nature of modern warfare in general." During his research for this book, he came across the figure of Admiral William D. Leahy, the subject of tonight's lecture. He's just completed a biography of Leahy, which will be published by Penguin Random House later this year. The project was helped when Professor O'Brien was one of only 3 scholars working outside the United States to receive a public scholar fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Phillips has also built up a considerable public profile in Scotland and the UK. He's a regular panellist on STV's Scotland Tonight and appears regularly on BBC Newsnight Scotland and the BBC Radio. He has testified a number of times in front of Parliament, including the Scottish Affairs Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. It reflects well on the university to see one of our excellent academics engaging so readily and meaningfully with the public and presenting cogently argued, clear opinions that arise from deep research foundation in strategic studies. And Phillips, we're very grateful to you for that. So I will now ask Professor O'Brien to deliver his inaugural lecture, Biography and Strategy. What can the life of one very conventional man tell us about the US and the world? Phillips.
Thank you very much for that, Gary. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, 2 very different figures in US history started both publicly and privately discussing what they considered the great international questions of the last few years. These 2 figures paid particular attention both to the end of the Second World War, particularly the decision by the United States to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the way in which the United States had moved from a wartime alliance with the USSR into what was now clearly a Cold War. Both had played important, if quite different, roles in these decisions, and both certainly had strong opinions about them. And interestingly, their opinions were practically identical. When it came to the atom bomb, both were decidedly negative. Both publicly, actually, made great stand of how critical they had been over the United States government's decision to use the atom bomb. One of them said that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Employment of the atomic bomb will take us back in cruelty towards non-combatants to the days of Genghis Khan. It will be a form of pillage and rape of society, done impersonally by one state against another. The other person, Justice Strident, said, "It is the one great mistake of my career. I have always condemned the use of the atomic bomb against Japan." The two men spoke similarly when it came to the start of the Cold War, particularly what we consider this period 1947 to 1948, the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, which reached a pitch really in the Berlin crisis of 1948. They looked on the transformation of the United States in these years into a form of the world's policeman, both with great regret. They believe it marked a sort of change that they both had strong opinions against. One of them said that I believe, if I can read, that America may totally succumb to the feel for militarization which engulfed Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. There is real danger of political power, and the power to influence the minds of the people will pass increasingly into the hands of the military. The other person, speaking similarly, said these decisions in 1947 and 48 were a historic error that will be accepted by many people as a stated policy of interference in their internal affairs. It is a direct reversal of traditional American policy. And yet, for all the similarities in outlook, these men could not have been more different. One you undoubtedly know. He was probably the most famous scientist of the 20th century or modern era, and that is the physicist Albert Einstein. Einstein, a socialist, had played a crucial role in the United States developing and starting its atomic weapons program, but had quickly soured on it and the direction the United States was taking. After the war, he began a campaign against what he called the militarization of American policy, typified by the Truman Doctrine. The person who shared Einstein's misgiving is someone almost all of you do not know. Of course, you probably read the lecture title, so you have an idea. But he was even more intimately involved with the decisions both to use the atom bomb against Japan and to start the Cold War in the late 40s. He is William D. Leahy, that fine-looking man on the right. And from 1942 to 1949, he was, at least for 4 or 5 of those years, the second most powerful person in the United States government. The fact that you do not know him is a sign of his success. Leahy had no desire to be popular or even to be rich, quite extraordinary. He could have cashed in many times. He died with what we would consider a lower middle class amount of savings in the bank. He wanted to serve the President of the United States and through that impose his vision on American foreign and strategic policy. He wanted the substance of power and he could care less about the style. And I think that makes him quite special when you look at the history of policymaking in this period. Now, I first became intrigued by the role that Leahy played in the US government while writing How the War Was Won, which for those of you who have had the fortitude to get through, and my guess is no one in this room has been able to get all the way through that book, is not a light romp. And it is not biographical. It's a very quantitative-based study of production and sort of economic allocation. And yet, as I was reading for that book and reading sort of about Second World War strategy and how equipment was being used, he was always there. He was always in the room. He didn't speak as much as some, but he spoke. And yet no one after the war seemed to go in to study his role. They talked about many other people, be it Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's close advisor, Ernest King, the head of the Navy, or most famously George Marshall, who I really think was a true celebrity general of the time. Whereas Leahy remained an undeveloped, shadowy character in the background. Again, he was often sort of dismissed with little epithets that people would use to categorize him. The most common was crusty. The few times you see Leahy discussed, he's almost always crusty, as if he's a clown. Or old or cantankerous, some kind of word that would instantly pigeonhole him as some hardline military officer. And yet the more I went through the military, and by the way, I'll throw the quotes up. That's, you can see Einstein, and that's Leahy, which one said which in the way that they analyzed it. And that's the one on the Truman Doctrine. Leahy's actually harsher, calling it a historic error. And actually, I would say Leahy was harsher on the atom bomb. He's the one who calls it a return to the Dark Ages. Not just a mistake, but a historic mistake by the United States. Yet the more I went through the major strategic decisions made by the United States during the war, the more I was surprised to discover that actually Leahy ended up winning every fight. If you actually go through the decisions made, and I'll take you through some of them later, it's remarkable. He triumphs in every fight when it comes to a strategic disagreement within the American High Command. And I became increasingly intrigued to finding out more about him. And that's how I moved from doing this quantitative-based study of the war to really a biography, something I'd never thought I would have written in my career. And this has resulted in the recent completed manuscript. Now, writing a biography, as I've found out, especially a biography of a senior policymaker, opens up some really difficult challenges when it comes to bias, personal outlook, or indeed the importance of a character in a historical frame. When I was a graduate student, I remember one of the first research seminars I ever attended was given by the great political biographer Ben Pimlott, who really has written a number of brilliant biographies, including of Hugh Dalton. He said at that talk that one of the fundamental dilemmas for anyone writing a biography was that the author, as the author, you grew instinctively either to love or hate the subject, with both emotions equally problematic. Actually, what he said is you grow to love the subject, except if you're writing about Stanley Baldwin. That anyone who's written a biography of Stanley Baldwin hated him, but everyone else loves their subject. And if I might adapt this, I think there was actually, the more I wrote about Leahy, the more I was aware of this in my mind. I think the issue for the author of a biography is that you end up identifying with the subject's aims and being sympathetic to their points of view. Much more so than personally liking them. And sort of this was my dilemma with Leahy. Leahy is in many ways not a lovable man. He was outwardly the most conventional man of his time. If you get a little bit of flavor from him from those pictures in there. He was a chain-smoking, hard-drinking, drank at lunch and dinner every day, swearing, politically Machiavellian racialist who despised modern art, modern music. He called jazz that junk my son was playing, and anything that might have stretched him culturally. A conversation with Leahy would not have been, a delightful cultural experience. He lacked that. What was he? He gambled. He loved playing cards for money. He was a particularly tough poker player, as Harry Truman found out. He golfed, he fished, though often more for political advantage than anything else. He loved cars and he owned dogs. But to give you an idea of his conventionality, his favorite dog he named Patriot, who was a Boston Terrier. And I've always said, I think I actually said this in my job talk, the greatest sign of his conventionality I could come up with is that lacking even the slightest scintilla of religious belief, he converted to Episcopalianism. And he served on the church vestry for much of the later years of his life. He just served on the vestry. After he would have a meeting with Roosevelt and Marshall and King, he would go decide church toilet policy for St. Thomas's Church in Washington, D.C. And yet, for all this profound conventionality that we say which infused his outlook, what I came to identify, and maybe overly identify with, where there were many surprising things about both what he believed the United States should do during the war and after. He was actually a moderating influence for much of his time in office, and the United States would have fought a very different Second World War had he not been in place, and had he been able to win some fights during the Truman administration, it would have entered into a very different Cold War. Now, both his conventionality and the surprising elements of his outlook revealed from very early in his career. And I'm going to do a little biography here and take you through his career to explain how he reached this extraordinary and I would say unprecedented position in the history of the United States government. He was born in Iowa, and he was raised in northern Wisconsin, in pretty remote towns. These were not big towns he came from. He was the son of a first-generation Irish immigrant couple. His father, I think, is best described as an eager failure. He got elected once to the Iowa State Legislature, but couldn't do anything, then moved to Wisconsin, where he took up law practice, but never seemed to thrive. Though, as money was particularly short, Leahy, while not dirt poor, very interestingly learned very early in life to get on with little in the way of luxury. He never seemed to have a great craving for money or a need to sort of have expensive things. He had two great breaks in his career. The first was when he was 18. Being a young man from the Midwest, his great dream was to get a place at West Point, the United States Military Academy. However, there was none that he could get. These were too prized by boys of the Midwest. However, a local congressman did have a slot at the U.S. Naval Academy because guys from the Midwest tended to be afraid of the sea. So they were less prized. And Leahy leapt at the chance and headed off to Annapolis in 1893. Leahy thrived in the Navy. That picture on the left I'll get to. That's one of the earliest pictures we have of him. It revealed a great deal about his nature. Right away, his colleagues in Annapolis recognized his political his political understanding. One of his lifelong friends was Thomas Hart, who would later be quite a famous U.S. admiral during the war, and then a U.S. senator after the war from Connecticut. And he described Leahy in the 1960s as this at Annapolis. As a student at the academy, Leahy was not good, a little lazy. And that's actually true. Leahy came in 35th out of 47th in his class. But when his classmates had a problem, a dispute about an issue, someone would say, let's go ask Bill Leahy. He's got better sense than all of us put together. I think that was quite an insightful, his political understanding was earlier. After Annapolis, Leahy went right to war. He leaves Annapolis in 1898, and as those of you who know a little bit about that, that's when the United States goes to war with Spain. His first assignment was on a battleship, the USS Oregon, and that's where that picture on the right is taken. This meant that he both served off the coast of Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and then later ended up in the Philippines. Interestingly, his writing at the time, right away from the beginning, revealed him to be more than a little skeptical of both these wars in Cuba and in Spain. Indeed, when he first gets to Cuba, he writes in his diary that this is all pointless. He has this strong anti-imperialist critique is over. When, after Cuba is attacked and taken over by the United States, that campaign is over, he volunteers for service in the Pacific. And this means that he ended up taking part in really one of the nastiest conflicts the United States would ever fight, and that is the American pacification of the Philippines, which they had seized from Spain during the Spanish-American War. In fact, this trip for Leahy, from about 1899 to 1902, to Asian waters, was probably the most important trip of his life. It revealed both a great deal about his nature and established within him a set of passionately held political and international beliefs, which would shape American policy later. I think from the very beginning, the two sides of the conventional and unconventional nature of Leahy were revealed. And they're revealed right away. The first port of call, as you are heading from the United States to the Philippines in 1899, is you stopped at the island of Guam. Now, Guam was another island seized from the Spanish, and it was as close to a tropical paradise as Leahy had ever encountered. The near nudity, open sexuality, and non-acquisitive lifestyle of the islanders sparked the censorious that was never far below the surface. His first impression was that of a bigot. This is what he writes in his diary. The natives are indolent and worthless, having no idea of the value of time or money, living as they do on the fruit provided bountifully by the tree used in the construction of their simple houses. They do not need to work and are therefore happy in idleness. Morality as we know it is unknown to them. They consider falsehood entirely justified, and shockingly, marriage entirely a matter of option before the arrival of the Americans. Yet, a few days after he arrived in Guam, something rather unexpected happened. A reflective Leahy appeared, and as he was getting ready to leave, a quiet life, all of a sudden, of fruit and sex did not seem so bad. He wrote, "It seems to me that one might learn something about human happiness by interacting with these people. They have little and want nothing. Living in grass huts and one story above pigs and chickens, wearing what clothes they can find, and subsisting on whatever fruit grows near, they appear to be happy and contented beyond the usual lot of humans." And statements like that which save Leahy, I think, in his nature. Of course, paradise could not hold him, and he was soon off to the Philippines. The war that he took part in, and I won't go into detail, was really one of the nastiest in U.S. history. It saw American forces use extreme force, torture, summary executions to put down a Filipino nationalist uprising. And once again, Leahy's two nature sides came out. He was appalled at the behavior of many American military men, and at one point he sinks into a depression. When he hears stories of the torture of Filipino prisoners, at one point he actually witnesses the summary execution of a Filipino guerrilla. He condemns his own countrymen, and he condemns the whole war. He believed it was pointless and reconfirmed the basic anti-imperialism in his nature. And yet, for all of that, he was determined to succeed. Leahy drove himself forward. He didn't like what he was doing, but he was going to take advantage of that. He worked extremely hard to be noticed, even gaining his first command, which was a captured Spanish gunboat. When he returned to the United States almost 3 years later after this cruise, he was a confident and determined young man, I think with a great deal of ambition. What he had done, he's also found a way, you could see his political skills come out. He had a way of impressing commanders, and really, you might say, kissing ass, which helped him very much get forward. Most of the way he impressed the commanders was by working extremely hard and by his competence, but it was also down to these political skills. One of the commanders he really impressed, it was at the time, and you see that picture of him in 1910, I think, is probably the best picture of the early Leahy I've found. Not a happy guy, but a pretty determined guy, if you look at that face, with the officers on the USS California. While that picture was being taken, the commander of the ship was a legend in the fleet, a captain called Henry Mayo. Mayo would be the most important American commander during the First World War. And basically, Leahy works very hard and becomes a favorite of Mayo when he's serving on the USS California. This is the great second break in his career, because not long after this picture is taken, in 1912, Mayo is in Washington as the head of the Navy's personnel, which Mayo hates because he wants to be at sea. But he says, to get this job done, I need William Leahy as my aide. So he takes Leahy off the California, and he makes him his aide in Washington, D.C., and the head of personnel. Having done that, Mayo skips town, and he reassigns himself to the battleship fleet. And what that means is when William Leahy comes in the morning, and he sits down at his desk, he looks directly at the face of that man on the right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, in 1913, becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he and Leahy end up sharing a desk they never should have shared. They share it because Mayo's left Leahy in charge of the personnel office. He should have been an aide, but he ends up running the bureau. And this is the great break in the career. When Leahy and Roosevelt meet each other, now I don't want to say it was love. That's way too hard a word. But Leahy certainly was wowed. And in his own way, Franklin Roosevelt was too. For Leahy, it was the force of the Roosevelt personality. We have to remember the Franklin Roosevelt of 1913, as that picture over there shows. He was tall, thin, terribly charismatic, had what you would call the Roosevelt stardust. And it just made a massive impression on this, not flamboyant, hardworking, somewhat dour naval officer. That Roosevelt was sort of a blast of light in his life. And Leahy instantly saw in Roosevelt everything that he believed an American political should be. In a way, I do think he falls in love with Roosevelt, because it's a feeling that never leaves him for the rest of his life. I mean, up until the moment he dies, Leahy waxes rhapsodic about the impact of Franklin Roosevelt in his life. Now, Roosevelt was not quite as bowled over by William Leahy. And yet, on the other hand, he picks him out as quite a junior naval officer at the time, and he starts keeping him close. It's very interesting how Roosevelt figures. It's like I think he saw that Leahy had certain talents that Roosevelt lacked. Leahy was completely discreet. You could trust him with all your secrets. He'd never say anything. He'd always get the job done, and he was incredibly reliable. And in a world where, and to understand Franklin Roosevelt, you have to understand he trusted almost nobody. That was the secret to his success, was a lack of trust. He trusts William Leahy, and he trusts him from the moment he meets him. I think one of the early indications of that is that by 1914, he's allowing William Leahy to sail his family up and down to Campobello Island and up and down to the family estate in Hyde Park. He's entrusting Eleanor and the children to Leahy. And while he does that, he invites Leahy to stay for vacations. Very unusual early relationship that Roosevelt and Leahy are developing. Now, that being said, I wouldn't say they were the best of bosom buddies at this stage. After the First World War, for about 12 years, they really saw each other rarely, as both went their own ways and tried to build their own careers. However, it was after Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 that they start spending a great deal of time together. By this time, Leahy's actually reaching the end of his career. He formally retires in 1939, and while clearly a candidate to get the top jobs in the fleet, he was not guaranteed of either being commander of the battle force, which is the highest sea command you can have at the United States Navy in the 30s, or chief of naval operations. Roosevelt, however, quickly saw Leahy as his key naval officer, and basically he gives him every major job in the fleet between 1933 and 1939. Between 1935 and 1937, Roosevelt did appoint Leahy as the commander of the battle force. Had Pearl Harbor happened in 1935, 36, Leahy probably would have gone down in history as one of the great failures. Or he would have then fought the war at sea, because he would have been in control of the American fleet between 1935 and 1937. Between 1937 and 39, he serves as the senior American naval officer ashore, and that's the chief of naval operations. That makes him the senior naval advisor to the president. And at this point, Roosevelt started keeping him closer than ever. Their relationship really was far more closer than a president and a military officer had before. Roosevelt started calling in Leahy for general chats about world politics. They would have these afternoon sort of brainstorming sessions, and crucially started entrusting him with political tasks. Most revealingly, he starts including Leahy in his private life. That picture on the right is actually a holiday they take together in 1939. They're supposed to be going to witness a Fleet Exercise 20 in the Caribbean, but they leave 10 days before the fleet exercise and go fishing. And that's them relaxing together as they go on a holiday in 1939. And this leads, I think, to Roosevelt making, if you want to say, one of the classic moments where we simply don't understand the Roosevelt-Leahy relationship, or indeed Leahy's role in Roosevelt's life. It's the decision that Roosevelt makes in 1942 to make Leahy his chief of staff. Now, if you read the history books, you'll read that George Marshall tells Roosevelt in 1942 he needs to make Leahy his chief of staff, because that's what Marshall says. And Marshall's biography says that, and people in the Army say that. Actually, if you look at the documents, Roosevelt begins preparing Leahy to be his chief of staff in 1939. They can see the war coming. It's quite clear it might. And in April 1939, a few weeks after this picture was taken, he said, and I have the quote, that he concludes at that point that he wants to have Leahy, if war breaks out, by his side as an aide and an advisor. A few weeks later, he says if war breaks out, he wants to have him by his side as someone to chair a group bringing together the Army, Navy, and State Department, something like the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And for the next few months and years, Roosevelt is actually preparing Leahy for this role. It's not an impromptu decision in 1942 where George Marshall does it. It's something Roosevelt decides in 1939 and spends the next few years getting him ready for it. Now, interestingly, there is a bit of a dilemma Roosevelt has in that Leahy has to retire in September 1939 because he's reached his statutory retirement age. What Roosevelt does is give him important posts to give him seasoning. First, he makes them left governor of Puerto Rico, which he is from 1939 until 1940. That's his wife, Louise, in the picture as well on the left. And then, I think, as best example of how Roosevelt trusted his discretion, when France falls in 1940 and the Vichy government is set up, Roosevelt is desperate to keep Vichy from getting too close to Nazi Germany. He thinks Leahy is the only person he can trust with that diplomatic assignment. So he takes Leahy out from being governor of Puerto Rico and makes Leahy his ambassador to Vichy France. Now, this only lasts until 1942, after Pearl Harbor and the United States goes to war. It takes a very frustrating few months for Roosevelt to get Leahy out of Vichy. Leahy's stuck in France when Pearl Harbor happens. Roosevelt wants to get him out, but it takes about 3 or 4 months because they're trying to work on international politics at the time. He gets Leahy back by April, May, and in July he appoints him as his chief of staff. And he actually creates, I would argue, the most powerful single military officer position in the history of the United States for his friend. These are a list of just some of his titles that he accumulates. The first top 2 are indeed ones he holds during his entire career from 42 till he retires again in 1949. He is Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, and he is Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Think about that. Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. What that is he's the first national security advisor. What you would do as Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief is about every morning at 8 o'clock, Leahy would slip into the White House quite unobtrusively, and he would go through all of the president's confidential correspondence. He would decide what was unimportant, what was moderately important that Bill Leahy, could actually respond to in the president's name, and what was so important that he had to discuss it with the president. Around 9:30, well, it was supposed to be 9:30, but as Roosevelt got older and sicker, it got closer to noon, really. But about 9:30, the president would come down from his bedroom, and the two would then retreat to the super-secret map room next to the Oval Office, where Leahy would then brief Roosevelt on the developments of the day. The two would discuss strategy, and then the president would verbally relay any decisions that he wanted Leahy to transmit to the rest of his government. And this is what it turns out, one of the reasons why historians and scholars have gone into him. He never had to write anything down for the president. He talked to the president every day, multiple times a day. He was actually the only person in the US government who had that kind of role. Now, within that, he actually had the role of chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That was usually that's considered the highest military officer. It was actually Leahy's second role. The phrase they used at the time wasn't chairman. They don't start using that till 47, but they call him the senior member of the Joint Chiefs, and he presides. He actually chairs the Joint Chiefs with me. And again, this was a new post created for him by Franklin Roosevelt. When the Joint Chiefs met, and it was the head of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Army Air Force, Leahy always took the chair. He introduced subjects into conversation, he guided discussions, and crucially, he also told the other chiefs what they couldn't discuss because Roosevelt had already made up his mind. And that was another source of influence because the chiefs never knew whether Leahy was telling the truth. If Leahy could actually just cut off when Roosevelt says you can't discuss it, they wouldn't know. They never saw it. The best way, I think, this is a chart I had great fun putting together, and it's called Presidential FaceTime from July 42 to April 1945. And we can see how many times Roosevelt meets with who we would consider the inner circle of American war-making during the Second World War. On the right, you have the civilians. Now, there is Harry Hopkins, who the president meets quite a lot. Hopkins is sort of his alter ego from 1940 to 42. But then Roosevelt begins falling out with Hopkins, 43, 44, and their relationship really cools. These small circles are actually the people who we think had power but didn't. That's the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, the 104. That's the Secretary of the Navy, poor Frank Knox, 32. He hardly ever saw the president. And that's the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, 47. The entire war, the Secretary of War meets the president once a month. Yeah, that's all. On the right are the military, the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. George Marshall sees Roosevelt 95 times during the war. Probably 5 of those were alone. Marshall might have had 5 singular meetings with Roosevelt. The head of the Navy gets 81, the head of the Army gets 66. I can't count William Lee. He met Roosevelt every day, sometimes twice a day. He would go away out for months with him. I put the 500 plus, it's probably 1,000 plus, if you wanted to actually do the time calculation. And within that, you could even argue that certainly Leahy spent more time with Roosevelt than that whole group together, except for maybe Harry Hopkins. If you added Hopkins also had a lot of time with Roosevelt. Now, what this means is that, particularly as time goes by, 43, 44, he becomes the second most powerful man in the US government, and I would argue, as the title of my book would say, the second most powerful man in the world because of this. As other people, as Roosevelt weakens, from 43, 44, Roosevelt is getting very ill. He cannot work. People are begging for 5 minutes with him, whereas Leahy is with him every day. He has unlimited access to the president if the president's in Washington. And he does this to actually impose his vision of the war. When you look at the great strategic decisions the United States makes in the war, and there are a number of major ones, Leahy ends up winning every one, fighting the war, making the United States fight the war the way he wants. What is his view? Well, his view was really that of a longtime naval officer who had an indirect notion of warfare. He had one that you think was quite different for certain military people. One, he actually believed in casualty minimalization. He wanted to keep Allied casualties to as small a number as possible, and actually he was very worried about access to civilians. He was one of those who really believed that you had a moral duty to reduce civilian casualties for the Axis. The way you kept casualties low for the Americans was you fought a machine-based war over a human-based war, so that you had machines do the heavy lifting, not human beings. You also fought that war by avoiding great battles, but really controlling communications is the phrase. You use air-sea power to control communications. You weaken the enemy. You only fight battles when you have to, is Leahy's view. And when you look at the decisions that happened between 1942 and 1943, I've made this chart. You can see the fights that go on in the American government over what to do. Each one of these, Leahy and Marshall take a profoundly different position, and they fight for it, and Leahy wins every one, starting with the decision to invade North Africa in 1942. People are often confused. Well, why does Roosevelt want to invade North Africa in 1942? George Marshall hates the idea. Ernest King hates the idea. Leahy had been lobbying that from when he was in Vichy France a year before. As soon as he becomes his chief of staff, he supports that we have to go into North Africa, partly because he wants to keep Marshall from invading France in 1943. It's a preemptive thing to keep what he considers a very dangerous campaign. The next decision later that year, which I think is actually one of the most profound decisions, is Leahy decides what the US government's going to build for its military. If you look at military, there's a lot of boys' own military history, which is all based about dashing battles and Rommel and all that nonsense. Which looks at strategy as almost a board game, moving pieces. The highest level of strategy in any war is not where or how, it's what. The decision is what you make, because what you make will determine the wheres and the hows. And the US government has a huge debate in late 1942 over what to build. Marshall wants to build a large army. He wants 200 divisions. He basically wants to create a massive land force. Leahy wants a large air force and a large navy. Lo and behold, Leahy wins. And you end up with a very small. The United States fights the Second World War with an unprecedentedly small army. Then you have another series of decisions in December 42, and I won't go through each one, but basically if you go through the key decisions of the Second World War, Leahy will win every one over George Marshall. And that is, if you look at it in a nutshell, the United States in the Second World War fights Bill Leahy's war, more than anyone else's. Because I don't think Franklin Roosevelt had many strong opinions on strategy. He was far more malleable, whereas Leahy had much stronger ones. So Leahy's influence is really at its high point between 1942 to 1945. And it's one that Roosevelt actually acknowledges. By 1945, Roosevelt's very sick and ill, and he admits that he's handing over a lot of authority to Leahy. Two examples of that. In the most famous conference of the war, the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt does an unusual thing. He makes Leahy a member of the political committees. Usually the military officers sat for the military officers, and then Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill would sit with their civilian advisors. But what Roosevelt does is he makes Leahy his chief advisor at Yalta. As he says, "You're the only person I can trust." And he has him there. The last words that Roosevelt ever says to Leahy, which is on about April 7th, before Roosevelt heads off to the vacation where he dies, was, "Have a good break, Bill, when I'm gone, because when I'm back, I'm going to unload even more stuff on you, and you'll have to work even harder." That was the last word said between the two of them. Then we end up with the last period of Leahy's power, which is not actually quite as smooth as the first. And I'll go through this relatively quickly because I'm aware that my time is running up. And this is the transition to Truman. To begin with, this relationship looks like it's going to be very problematic. Leahy, until the moment Truman becomes president, basically looks at him as a second-rater. His one dealing with Truman had been when Truman, in the act of a really Bush League politician, had called up Leahy in 1939 to try and get a friend a promotion in the Navy. That had been his sole interaction with Truman at this time. During the war, of course, Leahy's with Roosevelt. Roosevelt has no time for Truman, so Truman enters the White House with no knowledge of Roosevelt and no knowledge of Leahy. Truman makes a decision very early on to keep Leahy as his chief of staff. And he says, "Oh, I'm going to let things go on much as they can before." However, that's impossible. You cannot replicate 32 years of friendship, which Leahy and Roosevelt had at that point, in just a few days. Now, Truman and Leahy do eventually become friends, but it's a very different, less intense friendship than the one that Leahy has with Roosevelt. It's more respectful on the case of Truman. I think Truman looked at Leahy as someone so close to Roosevelt, as someone quite experienced, but at the same time, therefore, someone to rebel against. That Leahy was this older, Roosevelt-plated figure, and at times Truman would then tweak Leahy, at times he would become irritated with Leahy. Leahy certainly grew to respect Truman far more than he expected, but on the other hand, he thinks occasionally he's a bit of a hobo. He thinks that Truman lacks certain gravitas, whereas he can't stand up in Leahy's mind to Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt remains this paragon, and Truman, though he tries very hard, is never going to be Franklin Roosevelt. On the other hand, they work very well. I think that picture, I actually use that in my talk, that sort of encapsulates a bit of their relationship. Truman's looking at Leahy, the older man, partly to get his approval, but he's going to go back afterwards and say, "That old bastard." And Leahy doesn't give two figs. He's making sure the fishes are weighed properly because they're betting. This is a gambling event. They're trying to see who caught the most fish. And so Leahy wants to win the money. So that sort of encapsulates their different nature. Politically, the most important thing is that Leahy's special position was now lost. He was no longer the second most powerful man in the government. He was one of a handful of very important people advised. Truman listened to a lot more than just Leahy. Roosevelt was listening to Leahy 44, 45. Just for instance, this is actually when George Marshall has influence. Truman worships George Marshall. George Marshall is an Army guy, and Truman's an Army guy. And so from the moment he becomes president, Marshall actually goes up in estimation. Right away, I think we can see the changed policy environment by the decisions that Leahy begins to regret. And these are two, the end of the war and the atomic bomb. Leahy has a very special and it's a unique position in how he believes the war against Japan should end. As you look on both the top and bottom quotes, he neither wants to invade Japan nor use the atom bomb. His view is that Japan is defeated. It's quite clearly defeated by early 1945. You don't need to use an atom bomb if it comes about, and crucially, you don't have to invade. It won't be great for the Japanese. They might be starved into submission, right? But they will have to understand that they're defeated, and they will understand that they are defeated. And so he begins, and he's working on Roosevelt on this, by the way, before Roosevelt dies. He's working on Roosevelt neither to invade Japan nor to use the atom bomb. And I think this is one of the areas, again, where Leahy's character has been misunderstood. When Leahy's discussed about the atom bomb, and he is discussed quite regularly, he's usually made to seem a fussy old Luddite arguing that the bomb wouldn't work. And he does. He often, Leahy says a number of times, "It just won't work. I know it won't work." But what that is actually an intense form of wish fulfillment. As he admits in this quote, which is before the bomb goes off, this is to someone he trusts very closely. I don't think it's going to work, but if it does, it's going to have terrible, terrible consequences for the future. What Leahy wants is he wants the US government to say to the world, we have the bomb, and it was so horrible we didn't use it, to make that kind of moral message. And that's the position. But he has no support in the Truman administration for that double-track policy. The big, profound difference was that Truman himself likes the atom bomb. He's energized by the atom bomb. He looks at it as a way out of a political problem. So the second the atom bomb is developed, it's going to be used. And there's nothing that Leahy can do. Now, losing that fight was indicative of the great struggles he would have between 1945 and 1949. I will go through this very quickly. He actually wins a number of important fights that history doesn't pay much attention to because they're bureaucratic more than anything else. For interesting, the Department of Defense is reorganized along Leahy's lines in 1947 to 1948. He very much is the guiding factor in Defense Department reorganization. He's the driving force behind the early CIA. He actually gets his own post abolished because he thinks it's too powerful. He makes sure no one continues in his jobs after he goes. And so he has quite significant bureaucratic victories in this time. However, he loses most of the great foreign policy fights. And this is the interesting thing, because his vision is too restrained. Leahy had a really quite distinct vision of what he wanted the United States to be. Crucially, he is a man of the pre-war years. He does not want the United States transformed into the world's policeman. He does accept, grudgingly, he said, we have to accept Soviet domination of the East. I don't like it, I'm not going to sleep well about it, but it's a reality. Poland is gone. The East is gone. And there's no point in making a war over something that's lost. Even more intensely than that, he wants the US out of the Middle East. Leahy absolutely thinks the Middle East has no advantages for the United States, and the United States should play no role in Middle Eastern politics. He believes in one area of effort, China. China is the one area where he believes the United States should try and play a role because he says China will help determine the future. He really believes, has a view of security, which is if you don't directly threaten the United States, if your sort of position isn't one of direct security concern, err on the side of caution. Don't err on the side of intervention. It was in US relations with the USSR, I think, that this is mostly misunderstood. He certainly wanted the country to follow a tougher line than followed by FDR, but he also doesn't want the Truman Doctrine. That's the irony of it. He wants the United States to toughen up rhetorically, but he doesn't want the United States to become Europe's and the world's guardian angel at the same time. If you want to see, I think, really some of the most thoughtful things Leahy ever wrote, it's in the summer of 1946, when Truman actually asks everyone who he thinks matters to contribute to a memorandum. Truman's confused about what the US government should be doing. The president actually asks for advice. And Leahy sits and he writes his own memorandum to Truman about what the United States should do towards the Soviet Union. And he writes the most dovish memorandum of anyone around Truman. Everyone else writes a harsher one, be it Jimmy Forrestal, be it Thomas Patterson, the Secretary of War, be it James Burns, the Secretary of State. As Leahy said, the USSR is still weaker than the United Western Powers. The Communist Party is still a highly successful dictatorial political machine, but it is no longer a source of emotional inspiration to the people. I don't overrate this, is what he's saying. Don't overrate the Soviet Union. Don't think it is this threat to you. You must recognize the character of the opposition and study it patiently and objectively. Don't overreact. Maintain our own principles with courage and self-confidence, and our greatest danger is that of becoming like those with whom we are coping. Probably the most thoughtful memorandum Truman gets in the summer of 1946 is by that crusty old admiral. And that is why, when Truman makes the decision in July 47 to announce the Truman Doctrine, Leahy is the most depressed man in the room. He believes it's a historic mistake. He doesn't want the United States to be transformed into the world policeman, primarily also for the last side, for what it means to this. Leahy is desperate to keep the United States out of the Middle East. You want to say the single most prescient thing he sees is he sees what he calls a decades-long civil war between Israel and the Arab states. He sees it before the foundation of Israel. So he spends 1946, 47, 48 trying to keep Truman from recognizing Israel. To him, if you do this, if you become the guarantor of Israeli security, you will end up in a decades-long war in the Middle East. He fails. He absolutely fails because Truman decides to do it. And on the day that Truman recognizes Israel, I think Leahy, more than anyone else, knows what's going to happen. That was his diary entry for the day. That picture, by the way, comes from a meeting between Roosevelt and Leahy at Ibn Saud right after Yalta. That's February 1945. But that diary, the Palestine situation at the present time, in my opinion, points directly towards a civil war between the Jews and the Muslims in Palestine, and possible in the Muslim-inherited areas of the Middle East. It appears certain that recent developments have been disadvantageous to the interests of the United States and may drag the United States into a war between two religious groups. 1947. 48, sorry. So, what then do we make of William Leahy? What is the point of this study beyond selling a lot of books to a lot of insurance executives in American airports? In some ways, it's the most old-fashioned academic endeavor I could have imagined, something I never thought I would do. In an era where people write histories of the color blue or grand overarching theories of international behavior, the study of a grumpy, cantankerous, very dead, very white man seems extraordinarily old-fashioned. And yet, doing this has changed my way, my perceptions, in a way I think a very modern book might not have done. And that is, we can learn something from both the fights Leahy wins and Leahy loses. A few points. I think one, and they're a bit combined, the first two, limitations of theory. There's no theory that applies to the fights that Leahy wins and loses. It's very much a political, Machiavellian, some go some way, some go the other. It's a personality-driven exercise. The United States does not fight the war based on any theory I could find. It bases it on shifting coalitions, shifting ideas, and the same with the Cold War. The second point, if even one of his fights after FDR is won, he loses a lot of them afterwards, but if even one, the one on the atom bomb, the one on the Truman Doctrine, the one on the Middle East, the world is a very different place today. He could have been very different. Had Franklin Roosevelt lived, and Leahy then been his closest advisor, it would have been. Two more points. One, the complexity of the military mind is something that comes out. He is the most dovish person around Harry Truman, and he is the oldest military officer in the room. The civilians are the hardliners. The military is the cautious one. Right? It's the one with the greatest military experience, and had they listened to the military, actually the Cold War might have been very different. It's the civilian leadership that is pressing the hard line. And finally, there's this point here, which I think is terribly resonant, and that's the possibility of a different role for post-1945 the USA. In many ways, it has a powerful applicability today. Right now, the USA is actually in relative decline. It could manage to be the world's police force for 40, 50 years. It can no longer do so, I would argue. China is growing, India is going to grow, America's relative economic advantage is going to erode, and that is not going to stop. What the United States has to do is not either try to pretend this hasn't changed and continue being the world's policeman, or retreat into a Donald Trumpian, isolationist madness. In fact, they would do very well if the United States took a look at Leahy's cautious internationalism of 1945 to 1949. It was an internationalism based on some interventions, but only if they have a more immediate security threat. Don't believe in domino theories, is what he's saying. Don't say if A happens, then B, and then C, and then D, and D's really bad, therefore we have to stop A. Don't take that kind of domino theory ideology. Say if A happens, that could be bad. And if A is bad, then you can intervene. And as I would say, that's not bad for a crusty old sea dog. Thank you.
Well, it's my very great pleasure to offer the vote of thanks to Professor O'Brien. Now, this was a lecture full of many interesting insights, and I can't possibly do justice to its full richness. And so I'll focus on three themes which resonated for me and also seem to be important lessons for the present times. The first theme is duty. Indeed, you could argue that the picture of Admiral Leahy that Professor O'Brien has painted has duty as its background. Would he have been in a position to exert the influence that he did without a history of duty, without a pattern of 52 years of service? It seems unlikely. Professor O'Brien's portrait of Leahy also shows, I think, that his commitment to duty was intimately entangled with the development of character. That was the second theme that struck me. Leahy's flawed, complex, but resolute character is evident in the most testing of times when every option has negative consequences, times when it could be convenient to forget principles in favour of expedience. Reflecting on Leahy's position on major issues, I am sure we all recognise that even in the midst of conflict, small or great, for the sake of our common humanity, to quote your lecture, our greatest danger is becoming like those with whom we are coping. And that leads me to the third theme, building on character, which is friendship. We can most effectively show our strength of character and say what we feel needs to be said, it seems, in the context of friendship. That applies whether we think of a long-standing close relationship or the sense of friendship due to all because of our common humanity that Leahy seems to realise later in his career. But there are actually two other minor points that I find helpful in Professor O'Brien's work on Leahy, in addition to those three major themes. And that is, it seems that substance can be more important than style, and that even uncharismatic individuals can make a real difference. For some reason, I find that to be personally affirming. In conclusion, Professor O'Brien, thank you for your memorable and inspiring work, and especially this lecture on an inspiring man that we could all do well to remember better. Professor O'Brien, thank you.